1878, Arizona Territory. The harsh sun beat down on Margaret Thornton's weathered homestead, her husband 2 years in the grave and her barn roof collapsing. When the gaunt Apache appeared at her gate, desperation outweighed fear. Locals warned her, "Don't trust a savage." But Margaret had lost everything except her farm, and winter approached. As Náshdí worked silently overhead, she noticed his strange rituals, whispered chants, peculiar carvings, resin mixed with what looked like blood. Was this repair or something more? The flood came without warning, a wall of water that devoured everything in its path. Could the ancient wisdom in one man's hands be enough to save not just a widow's barn, but heal the broken trust between two worlds? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn crept across the Thornton homestead, painting the weathered wood of the small farmhouse in hues of amber and gold. Margaret Thornton had been awake for hours already, as was her custom since Thomas had passed. Sleep never came easy anymore, not with the weight of the farm pressing down on her shoulders alone. She paused in her kitchen, calloused fingers tracing the tarnished silver of Thomas's pocket watch. It had stopped at precisely 4:17, the moment fever had finally claimed him 2 winters ago. She hadn't wound it since. Some part of her couldn't bear to see it move forward when Thomas never would. "Another day," she whispered to the empty room, tucking the watch back into her apron pocket. Outside, the October air carried the promise of winter. Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way to the chicken coop. 6 eggs today, good morning. The leghorns were laying well, despite the dropping temperatures. She'd need to trade 3 in town for sugar and coffee. If Mrs. Hollister was being fair with her prices, which she rarely was for a widow. The barn loomed in the distance, its roof sagging dangerously in the middle, where last spring's rains had rotted the central beam. Margaret sighed at the sight. Without repairs, it wouldn't survive the winter snows. Without the barn, she couldn't store enough hay for the milked cow and the 2 workhorses. Without the animals, the farm would fail. And without the farm, Margaret Thornton would have nothing left of the life she and Thomas had built together. "Morning, Margaret," Sarah Collins called from the road, her young face brightening as she waved. The girl was barely 20, widowed. Last year, when her husband took a bullet during a bar fight in Tucson. "Heading to town today?" "I am," Margaret replied, raising a hand in greeting. "Need anything?" "Just company on the walk, if you don't mind." They fell into step together on the dusty road, 2 widows of different generations, bound by common circumstance. Margaret appreciated Sarah's easy chatter. It filled the silence that had become too familiar in her life. "Sheriff Mills was asking after you yesterday," Sarah said, a hint of something in her voice. "Said he noticed your barn looking poorly." Margaret kept her eyes on the road. Did he now? "He's a good man, Margaret. Lonely since his Esther passed. He'd help with the barn if you'd only ask." "I don't need charity," Margaret said, more sharply than intended. She softened her tone. "Besides, what would people say? A widow inviting a man to her property without proper cause?" Sarah sighed, but didn't press further. They both knew the rules that governed women alone on the frontier. Reputation was often the only currency that mattered. The town of Copper Springs came into view, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a single main street. The general store, the blacksmith, the small church, and most importantly, to many the saloon. A town built on copper mines and cattle, surviving now on the steady stream of settlers heading west. Margaret had never intended to stay this long. She and Thomas had been California-bound when their wagon broke an axle just outside of town. Temporary repairs became a small plot of land, became a homestead, became 17 years of life. And now it was all she had left. inside Abernathy's general store. Margaret placed her eggs carefully on the counter. "Morning, Mr. Abernathy." The shopkeeper nodded, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose as he examined each egg with practiced care. "Morning, Mrs. Thornton. Fine-looking eggs today. Worth 3 pounds of sugar and some coffee beans?" she asked, knowing the haggling dance well. 2 pounds sugar, half-pound coffee, he countered. Times are hard with the mind slowing. Margaret accepted with a nod. It was fair enough, and Abernathy had always treated her with more respect than most. As he measured out the goods, Sheriff Mills entered the store, the jingle of spurs announcing his arrival before the man himself appeared. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, removing his hat. "A pleasure to see you in town." "Sheriff," she acknowledged. With a polite nod, "I was riding past your place yesterday. Couldn't help but notice your barn roof's in a bad way." "I'm handling it," Margaret said, keeping her voice even. The sheriff shifted his weight, hat in hand. "With winter coming on, it's no small job for a woman alone." "I'd be happy to." "Thank you, Sheriff, but I've made arrangements." The lie came, easily. Pride had always been Margaret's sin. "Oh?" Interest flickered in his eyes. "Hiring McCready's boys?" Margaret busied herself with her purchases. "I'll manage, Sheriff, but I appreciate your concern." The bell above the door jingled again. As Mrs. Hollister entered, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with undisguised interest. The town busybody never missed an opportunity to collect gossip. "Margaret Thornton," she said, her voice syrupy with false concern. "How are you managing, dear? We were just saying after service on Sunday how worried we all are about you out." "They're all alone." "I'm managing just fine, Mrs. Hollister," Margaret replied, gathering her goods. "Good day to you all." Outside, Margaret breathed deeply, steadying herself. The weight of their pity was sometimes harder to bear than the weight of her work. She started the long walk home, alone this time, Sarah having stayed behind to visit with her father. The sagging barn greeted her upon her return, a constant reminder of problems she couldn't solve alone. Margaret stood in her yard, staring at the structure, calculating costs she couldn't afford, labor she couldn't hire, time she didn't have. That was when she spotted him, a figure at the edge of her property, watching from the shadow of a juniper. Tall, unnaturally still, with long, dark hair and skin burnished by the sun. An Apache. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest as they locked eyes across the distance dot in that moment. Desperation and opportunity collided in Margaret Thornton's mind, forming a dangerous idea that would change everything. Hunger had been Náshdí's constant companion for nearly a moon now. The reservation rations had run short again, as they always did before winter. Aim was scarce in the hills where his people were now confined, the best hunting grounds claimed by white settlers. His medicine pouch hung light against his chest, the soft leather containing his most sacred items: eagle feather, white sage, river stones, and the small carved bear his father had made him as a boy. It was all he had left of his former life. Náshdí had walked 3 days from the San Carlos reservation, following what his people called the path of the water spirit, an ancient route his grandfather had shown him as a child. Something had called him east, a pulling in his dreams that he couldn't ignore. The old ways taught that such dream-walking was sacred guidance. He had passed 4 homesteads before reaching this one. At each, he had been met with shotguns, threats, or simply doors slammed in his face. He was used to it. To these people, an Apache was a threat, never a neighbor. But this place was different. The barn spoke to him. Its sagging beams cried out, like a wounded animal. And there was something about the land of harmony that had been carefully maintained, despite the disrepair of the buildings. Someone here respected the earth, when the woman emerged from the trees, carrying her packages. From town, Náshdí remained still. He had learned that sudden movements frightened white people. She saw him immediately, her body tensing. But she didn't run, didn't scream, simply stood, assessing him as he assessed her. She was not young, this woman. Lines mapped her face like the dry creek beds of his homeland. Her hands were work-roughened, her stance steady. A woman who knew labor. A woman alone. Slowly, deliberately, Náshdí raised his empty palms and gestured toward the barn. He pointed to the roof and made a motion of repair. The universal language of work offered. The woman's eyes narrowed, darting between him and the barn. He could see the calculation in her expression, fear, weighed against need. Finally, she nodded once and gestured for him to approach. "You fix roofs?" Her voice was steady, though her hand remained near the pocket where Náshdí suspected a small pistol might be hidden. Náshdí nodded, touching his chest. "Náshdí," he said simply. The woman frowned. "That your name?" He nodded again. "Náshdí," she attempted, the sounds awkward on her tongue. "I'm Margaret Thornton." She gestured to herself and to the barn. "Can you fix it before winter?" Náshdí walked slowly to the structure, aware of her watchful gaze following his every move. The barn was in worse condition up close. The central beam had rotted through where rainwater had pooled. The damage went beyond the visible. There was sickness in the wood, an imbalance that would take more than nails and boards to heal. He turned back to the woman Margaret and nodded. He could fix it, but not in the way she might expect. "I can't pay much," she said, seeming to take his nod as agreement. "Food and a place to sleep. A little money when it's done, if you do. Good work." Náshdí patted his stomach and nodded again. Food was what he needed most. He reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small bundle of dried herbs. Holding it up, he made a gesture of mixing and applying to wood. Margaret's brow furrowed. "You need herbs for the roof?" He nodded, then pointed to the nearby pines. Pine resin would be essential for the sealant his grandfather had taught him to make, a mixture that protected against water and rot for many seasons. "All right, then," she said after a moment's consideration. "But you sleep in the stable, not the house, and I'll be locking my door at night." Náshdí understood the meaning, if not every word. He had expected no less. Trust was as rare as water in the desert between their peoples. "Start tomorrow, sunrise," Margaret said firmly. She gestured toward a small lean-to adjacent to the stable. "Tools there. I'll bring food soon." With that, she turned and walked toward her house, her back straight and her steps deliberate. Náshdí noticed she didn't look back once, though. He suspected she was acutely aware of his every movement. Inside the stable, Náshdí spread his blanket in a corner away from the single horse's stall. The animal watched him with liquid brown eyes, ears flicking with mild interest rather than fear. Animals knew who to trust better than people did. He unpacked his few possessions, setting his medicine pouch carefully on a small shelf. From it, he removed a pinch of sacred tobacco, offering it to the 6 directions as he whispered prayers in his native tongue. For protection, for guidance, for the spirit of this place to welcome his work dot as the sun began to set, Margaret appeared at the stable door with a plate of food beans, cornbread, and a small portion of salt pork. She set it just inside the door, her eyes never leaving him. "Thank you," Náshdí said in English, one of the few phrases he had mastered. Surprise flickered across her features. "You're welcome," she replied automatically, then added more stiffly, "Sunrise tomorrow. Don't make me regret this." After she left, Náshdí ate slowly, savoring each bite. It had been days since his last proper meal. As darkness fell, he stepped outside to study the stars. Tomorrow, he would begin the work his dreams had led him here to do. Not just mending wood and shingle, but something more important. Something that would require all his skill and the wisdom of his ancestors. The night wind whispered through the junipers. It carried a scent of water, distant but approaching. Náshdí closed his eyes and listened. The spirits were restless tonight. Change was coming to this valley, change that would test them all. Margaret's wagon creaked under the weight of supplies as she guided her old Mare down Copper Springs Main Street. 3 days had passed since she'd hired Náshdí, and she needed more materials for the roof repairs. The Apache worked with quiet efficiency, but had indicated they needed proper timber to replace the rotted central beam. She tied the horse outside Abernathy's store, straightening her faded blue dress and patting her hair into place. She'd need to face the town's scrutiny sooner or later. Better to do it with her head high. Inside, conversation halted as the bell announced her arrival. 4 pairs of eyes turned to assess her Mr. Abernathy behind the counter, Mrs. Hollister and her daughter by the fabric bolts, and Sheriff Mills leaning against the back wall. "Morning," Margaret said evenly, moving toward the counter. "Mrs. Thornton." Abernathy nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "What can I help you with today?" "I need lumber. 2 12-foot beams, solid pine if you've got it, and a box of those long roofing nails." Abernathy's eyebrows rose slightly. "Quite an order. That barn repair coming along, then?" Before Margaret could answer, Mrs. Hollister abandoned all pretense of examining calico and bustled over. "Is it true what we've heard, Margaret? That you've hired an Apache to work on your property?" The direct question hung in the air. Margaret met the woman's gaze steadily. "I have hired a skilled worker who happens to be Apache, yes." The silence that followed was broken by Sheriff Mills pushing away from the wall. "Mrs. Thornton, with all due respect, that's a dangerous decision for a woman alone. I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I've made my choice." Margaret turned back to Abernathy. "About that lumber?" "Margaret," Mrs. Hollister pressed, her voice lowered to a stage. "Whisper, don't you remember what happened to the Peterson family 3 years back? Throats cut in their sleep by those savages." "That was never proven to be Apache," Sheriff Mills interjected, surprising Margaret. "More likely bandits from south of the border." "Regardless," Mrs. Hollister continued, "having one of them on your PROPRT, why people are talking, Margaret. Reverend Clark is concerned for your soul as well as your safety." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "My soul is between me and the Lord, Mrs. Hollister, and my safety is my own concern." She turned back to Abernathy. "The lumber, please. I'll pay extra for delivery." The storekeeper nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "I can have my boy bring it out tomorrow morning." "You make sure that boy is armed, Abernathy," Mrs. Hollister warned. "No telling what he might be riding into." "Enough, Eunice," Sheriff Mills said firmly. "Mrs. Thornton has the right to hire who she pleases." He turned to Margaret. "Though I'd feel better if you'd permit me to ride out and assess the situation." Margaret recognized the offer for what it was, both genuine concern and a chance to establish authority over Náshdí. "That won't be necessary, Sheriff." "But—" "Thank you." As Margaret paid for her purchases, the door opened again. Sarah Collins entered, her blonde hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. Her face brightened at the sight of Margaret. Mrs. Thornton. "I was hoping to find you here." She approached with an easy smile that faltered slightly at the tension in the room. "Is everything all right?" "Just fine, dear," Mrs. Hollister answered before Margaret could speak. "We're simply concerned about Mrs. Thornton's new employee." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I heard something about that from Pa." She turned to Margaret with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "Is it true? You've hired an Apache?" "Yes," Margaret replied simply. "He's doing good work." "Well," Sarah said after a moment, "that's what matters, isn't it? The quality of the work?" Mrs. Hollister made a sound of disapproval. "Honestly, Sarah, your father would be shocked to hear you talk so. After what those heathens did to your cousin back in '73, My cousin was a cattle thief and a drunk, Sarah replied with surprising firmness. Pa always said he probably started whatever fight got him killed. She turned back to Margaret. When? Will the roof be finished? Perhaps I could come see it sometime. Absolutely not, Mrs. Hollister gasped. A young woman like you, visiting a homestead with a savage present? It's entirely inappropriate. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward Sarah, even as she recognized the danger of the girl becoming a target for gossip herself. The work should be done before the first snow, she said. You're welcome any time, Sarah, but perhaps after the repairs are complete. Sheriff Mills cleared his throat. Mrs. Thornton, I respect your independence, but I have a responsibility to this community. I'll be riding by your property more frequently for the time being, just as a precaution. The bulletin board near the door caught Margaret's eye as she prepared to leave. A new notice had been posted, the paper still crisp and white against the weathered wood. Caution. Apache activity reported in region. Remain vigilant. Report sightings to sheriff immediately. Margaret felt a chill run through her. Such notices were common, but the timing couldn't be coincidence. Good day, she said firmly, gathering her remaining purchases. Outside, she took a deep breath of the autumn air, steeling herself against the weight of their judgment dot. As she untied her horse, she heard quick footsteps behind her. Sarah Collins approached, glancing over her shoulder to ensure they weren't overheard. Mrs. Thornton, she said quietly, don't mind them. My grandmother always said the Apaches were decent people before we started pushing them on to the worst. Lands, she hesitated. Is he ... Is he truly skilled with carpentry? Margaret nodded, touched by the young woman's open mind. Very skilled and respectful, Sarah smiled. Then you were right to hire him. I admire your courage, Mrs. Thornton. She squeezed Margaret's hand quickly before turning back toward the store. On the ride home, Margaret rehearsed what she would tell Náshdí. He deserved to know about the increased scrutiny, the sheriff's planned visits. Yet she worried such warnings might drive him away, leaving her barn half repaired as winter approached. As her homestead came into view, Margaret saw Náshdí on the roof, his movements precise and deliberate as he removed damaged shingles. For a moment, she allowed herself to wonder about the man, what life had led him here, what skills and stories he carried. Then she squared her shoulders and urged the horse forward. What mattered was the work, she reminded herself. Not the whispers of a narrow-minded town. Morning fog clung to the valley as Margaret crossed the yard carrying a steaming mug of coffee. 5 days into the repairs, and she'd fallen into the habit of bringing Náshdí a hot drink before he began his work. A small kindness that felt important somehow. She found him already examining the newly delivered lumber, running his hands along the grain with the reverence of someone who understood wood's secret language. He acknowledged her approach with a slight nod. Coffee, she said, extending the mug. Helps with the cold. Náshdí accepted it with both hands, the gesture somehow formal. Thank you, he said, the English words still careful on his tongue. Margaret watched as he sipped the bitter brew. She'd noticed he preferred it black, unlike most men who demanded sugar or whiskey to cut the taste. Another small detail that separated him from the cowboys and miners she'd known. Good wood, Náshdí said, gesturing to the lumber. Strong. Spirit. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Spirit? It's pine from up north. Náshdí nodded, setting down the coffee. He placed his palm flat against the beam and closed his eyes for a moment. Tree lived long, many winters. Good for ... holding. He made a sweeping gesture with his arm, encompassing the barn. For supporting weight, Margaret suggested, surprised by his poetic view of near building materials. Yes, Náshdí smiled briefly, the first she'd seen. It transformed his weathered face, softening the lines around his eyes. supporting. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden cup, intricately carved with symbols Margaret didn't recognize. Extending it toward her, he said, "For you." Margaret hesitated before accepting the unexpected gift. The cup fit perfectly in her palm, smooth and warm from being carried close to his body. Fine details had been carved into the wood spiraling patterns that reminded her of flowing water. "Did you make this?" she asked, tracing the designs with her finger. Náshdí nodded. "Last night, moon was good for creating." "It's beautiful," Margaret said honestly. "Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them, a first gift bridging their separate worlds. Margaret cleared her throat. "Will, you need help with the beam today?" Náshdí gestured to the roof. "Need hands to hold. I will show." They worked together through the morning, Margaret following his instructions as they positioned the new central beam. She was impressed by his methods, different from what Thomas had taught her, but undeniably effective. Náshdí used notches and joinery that required fewer nails, creating stronger connections. "Where did you learn this?" she asked during a break, wiping sweat despite the autumn chill. Náshdí pointed to his eyes, then made a gesture indicating a much taller man. His father showed him. He tapped his chest. "Apache way. Strong buildings, no waste." "My husband built this barn," Margaret said, surprising herself by sharing something personal. "Thomas. He died 2 winters ago." Náshdí nodded solemnly. "His spirit is here, in the wood." The statement should have sounded strange pagan, but Margaret found an odd comfort in it. The idea that something of Thomas remained in the structures he'd built with his hands. "Your people," Náshdí said carefully. "They fear Apache." The direct acknowledgement of the tension startled her. "Some do," she admitted. "There have been stories, raids, violence." "Both sides," Náshdí said, his dark eyes holding hers. "Blood on all hands." Margaret couldn't argue with the simple truth of it. "The sheriff may come by," she warned. "He's concerned." Náshdí nodded, unsurprised. "I will work. No trouble." They returned to their tasks, but something had shifted between them. Words came more easily now, a mixture of broken English, gestures, and the universal language of shared work. By late afternoon, when they stopped to eat, Margaret found herself asking questions she'd been holding back. "The symbols you've been carving in the rafters, what do they mean?" Náshdí seemed to consider how much to explain. Finally, he set down his plate and drew in the dirt with a stick a series of connected spirals. "Water paths," he said. "Rain comes, follows these. Paths. Safe paths. They're decorative?" Margaret asked, not quite understanding. He shook his head. "Protection. Old songs in the wood." He looked up at the sky, then back to Margaret. "Big water coming someday. Barn must stand." "A flood?" Margaret frowned. "The creek rarely rises, even in spring." Náshdí shrugged. "Dreams show water." "High water." He tapped his chest. "I listen to dreams." In another time, Margaret might have dismissed such talk, but there was something in his certainty that gave her pause. And hadn't she seen his skill with practical matters? His understanding of wood and structure was undeniable. As the sun began to set, Náshdí stopped work and walked to the edge of the property. Margaret followed, curious. He stood facing the western mountains, his expression contemplative. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "Signs," he replied simply. "Weather changes. Land speaks." In the fading light, Margaret saw what she hadn't noticed before. Náshdí wasn't just observing the sunset, but studying the patterns of birds flying south, the specific coloration of clouds on the horizon, the way certain plants had begun to fold their leaves. He was reading the land as clearly as she might read a book. "Will you teach me?" The question escaped before she could reconsider it. How to see these signs? Náshdí turned to her, genuine surprise in his expression. Then, slowly, he nodded. Tomorrow, I show you clouds that bring snow. Different from clouds that bring rain. As they walked back to the homestead, a comfortable silence between them, Margaret realized she was still carrying the wooden cup he had given her. A small thing, yet somehow it represented something significant. The first tentative bridge across the chasm that separated their worlds. A week into the repairs, the sky changed. Margaret noticed it as she gathered eggs, an unusual formation of clouds stacked high like towers in the western sky, their tops flattened as if pressed by an invisible hand. They reminded her of anvils, heavy with foreboding. Náshdí had been watching them since dawn, his work on the roof more urgent today. When Margaret brought his midday meal, she found him securing additional braces beneath the rafters that seemed unnecessary for a simple repair. "Storm coming," he said without preamble, pointing to the strange clouds. "Not normal storm. Big water." Margaret frowned, studying the distant formations. "Those don't look like rain clouds I've ever seen." "Different. Rain," Náshdí agreed. "High mountains get heavy rain. Water comes down to valley. Many days from now, maybe 1 week, need to be ready." "Flood waters? From the mountains?" Margaret shaded her eyes, trying to see what he saw in the distant peaks. "But it's not even raining here." Náshdí shook his head. "Not yet. But signs. Everywhere." He gestured around them. Birds flying high. Ants building tall. Snakes gone to high ground. Now that he mentioned it, Margaret realized she hadn't seen the usual garden snakes around the woodpile lately. And there were more ants than usual, their mounds indeed higher than she remembered. "The town should be warned," she said slowly. "If you're certain? They believe Apache?" Náshdí asked, his expression knowing. Margaret sighed. He was right, of course. The townspeople barely tolerated her hiring him. They'd never heed his weather warnings. "Perhaps not. But we should prepare here, at least." Náshdí nodded, returning to his work with renewed focus. "Need more wood, more rope. Special sealant for lower walls." "I'll go back to town tomorrow," Margaret promised, her mind already calculating what supplies they could afford. That evening, as Margaret prepared supper, Náshdí appeared at her kitchen door, the first time he'd approached the house uninvited. In his hands, he held a bundle of plants and a small pouch. "For protection," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Margaret nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. He moved respectfully through her space, going to each window and door. From his bundle, he selected different plant sage, cedar, and others she didn't recognize, and tied them in small bunches above each entrance. "Old ways," he explained as he worked. "Water spirits respect boundaries marked with sacred plants." Margaret watched, fascinated despite her Christian upbringing that warned against pagan rituals. "My husband would say we should trust in God's will," she said quietly. Náshdí continued his work without pause. "Your God made these plants, gave them power. Why not use gifts from Creator?" The simple logic gave Margaret pause. Put that way, it didn't seem so different from the herbs she hung to dry for medicines, or the garlic braids her mother had always kept in the kitchen to ward off illness. "The special sealant you mentioned," she said, changing the subject. "What does it contain?" "Pine resin, red clay, fat from animals." "Secret things." He glanced at her with the hint of a smile. "Would share, but would have to marry you. Apache law." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure if he was teasing or serious. "I'll leave the sealant to you then," she said primly. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of hoofbeats. Approaching her property, Sheriff Mills appeared in the yard, his expression grim as he surveyed the barn where Náshdí worked steadily. "Morning, Mrs. Thornton," he called, removing his hat. Thought I'd check in on your ... situation. Good. Morning, Sheriff, Margaret replied, wiping her hands on her apron. As you can see, the repairs are coming along well. Mills dismounted, his eyes never leaving Náshdí. Heard some strange talk in town. Abernathy's boy said your Apache was performing some kind of rituals up there. Chanting, marking symbols. Traditional building methods, Margaret said smoothly. Quite effective, actually. The sheriff frowned. Also noticed some mighty peculiar clouds yesterday. Old-timers at the saloon were discussing it. Some say it's an omen. Margaret saw an opening. Náshdí believes there may be flooding coming from the mountains. Heavy rains up high could send water down to the valley. That so? Mills studied the distant peaks skeptically. Doesn't look like rain country right now. He reads signs in nature, Margaret explained. Birds, insects, cloud patterns. The sheriff grunted. Indians do have ways about them. I'll grant that. He turned to her, his voice lowering. But Mrs. Thornton, people are uneasy. Reverend Clark mentioned you in his sermon Sunday. Not by name, but everyone knew who he meant. Did he now? Margaret felt a flare of indignation. And what Christian charity did he preach about a widow trying to keep her home intact? Mills had the grace to look uncomfortable. He spoke of susceptibility to heathen influences, concerns for your spiritual welfare. From the barn roof, Náshdí called down in his limited English, "Sheriff, look." He pointed west, where a new bank of clouds had appeared, darker than yesterday's formation. Mills squinted up at the sky. What am I looking at, exactly? Rain clouds different from snow clouds, Náshdí explained, climbing down the ladder to join them. These bring heavy water. See shape like buffalo's back? Old ones say that means earth will shake. Water will follow. The sheriff studied the clouds with obvious skepticism. Never heard that before. Many things not heard, Náshdí replied simply. Still true. An uncomfortable silence fell between the three of them. Finally, Mills replaced his hat. Well, Mrs. Thornton, seems things are progressing here. I'll be on my way. He lowered his voice as he passed her. Send word if you need anything. Anything at all. After the sheriff departed, Margaret and Náshdí stood watching the strange clouds build in the western sky. A wind had picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain. He does not believe, Náshdí said. No, Margaret agreed. But he might if the signs continue. Náshdí nodded gravely. Signs will continue. Water is coming. He turned to her, his expression solemn. Must work faster now. No time for town tomorrow. Need you to help more. Margaret nodded, a sense of urgency settling over her. Tell me what to do. Together they faced the western sky, where nature's warning signs continued to gather, visible only to those who knew how to read them. Lamplight flickered against the barn walls as Margaret and Náshdí worked late into the evening. 3 days had passed since the sheriff's visit, and the sense of urgency had only grown. The strange clouds appeared daily now, building higher each afternoon before dissipating at nightfall. Hand me that rope, Margaret said, pointing to the coil near Náshdí's feet. The words came easily now, their initial awkwardness replaced by the rhythm of shared labor as they secured additional bracing to the interior walls. Margaret's curiosity finally overcame her reserve. Náshdí, she began, how did you learn to read the weather so well? He continued working as he answered. My grandfather was weather watcher for our band, taught me from small boy time. He glanced at her. Your people have books. My people have stories, passed mouth to ear, many generations. Like an apprenticeship, Margaret suggested. My father was a blacksmith. He taught my brother every step, every secret of the forge. Yes, Náshdí nodded. Same way. Knowledge is valuable thing, not given easy. A comfortable silence fell between them as they completed the bracing. When they finished, Náshdí gestured toward the house. Rest now. I finish small things, Margaret hesitated. The easy comfort of working together had created a strange intimacy she hadn't expected. You should rest too. Come have some tea, at least. Surprise flickered across his features, quickly replaced by a nod of acceptance. Inside the small kitchen, Margaret busied herself with the kettle, while Náshdí sat cautiously at the edge of a chair, his presence filling the room in a way that wasn't unpleasant. This was the first time she'd invited him into her home proper, not just for his protective rituals. Her eyes fell on the family Bible that sat on a small table near the fireplace. Thomas had read from it every Sunday, maintaining what pieties they could so far from a proper church. She hadn't opened it since his passing. As she placed a steaming mug before Náshdí, Margaret found herself crossing to the Bible and bringing it back to the table. This is important to my people, she said, running her hand over the worn leather cover. Stories passed down, like your grandfather's teachings. Náshdí regarded the book with respectful interest. Many words inside? Yes, words about creation, about living rightly, about a great flood that covered the whole world once. The parallel struck her suddenly. Does your people have flood stories too? Náshdí nodded, his expression brightening with recognition. All tribes have great water stories. Long ago, when people forgot respect for earth, water came, changed everything. Margaret opened the Bible, carefully turning to Genesis. Here it says, God sent rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Only one family survived in a special boat they built. Our story's similar, Náshdí said. 4 mountains in our land were safe places. Some people reached high ground, listened to warnings. They lived. The unexpected parallel between their sacred texts created a bridge Margaret had anticipated. She found herself sharing more the story of Moses parting the waters, of Jesus calming the storm. Náshdí listened intently, occasionally, nodding in recognition of themes that resonated with his own traditions. Water is spirit in Apache stories, he explained. Powerful. Gives life, takes life, must be respected. In baptism, water washes away sin, Margaret said, makes a soul clean again. Same meaning, Náshdí said, tapping the table for emphasis. Washing spirit clean. Same truth, different words. Margaret felt something shift in her understanding, not just of Náshdí, but of the narrow way she'd been taught to view the world. What if these parallels weren't coincidence? What if there were deeper truths that all peoples glimpsed in their own way? From his pocket, Náshdí withdrew a small leather pouch and carefully opened it. Inside were various items, stones, feathers, dried plants, and small carved objects. He selected a piece of white shell and placed it on the table between them. Shell holds water, he explained. Sacred, used in ceremonies for good journey. He gestured toward the Bible. Like your cross? Symbol of protection. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose it is. She touched the shell gently. It's beautiful. For you, Náshdí said. Keep with Bible. Double protection. The simple gift carried weight beyond its size. It represented something profound, an acknowledgement of her beliefs alongside his own. Thank you, she said softly. Then, making a decision, she reached for the wooden cup he had given her days earlier, which now sat on her shelf. Would you teach me the Apache words for water? And cup? Náshdí's eyes widened slightly, then crinkled with a smile. Tea, he said, pointing to an imaginary liquid. Water is tea. He pointed to the cup. Bish tea be idla, thing for drinking water. Two, Margaret repeated carefully. Bish to be, idla. The foreign sounds felt strange on her tongue. Náshdí chuckled, the first time she'd heard him laugh. Good try? Again? As the evening deepened around them, they exchanged words. In both languages, simple things like sky, ya, earth, enai, rain, nault, alongside their English equivalents. Margaret found herself wondering what Thomas would think of this unlikely scene in his kitchen, his widow and an Apache man trading words and stories as equals. The thought brought no guilt, only a strange peace. Thomas had been a fair man, judging people by their actions rather than rumors. He would have recognized Náshdí's skill and integrity. Just as she had come to Dot when Náshdí finally rose to leave, there was a new ease between them. At the door, he paused, looking up at the night sky. "Stars clear tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, clouds return stronger. 2 days more work, then water comes." Margaret followed his gaze to the brilliant canopy above. The same stars had looked down on both their peoples for countless generations, witnessing their separate journeys that had somehow converged at this moment on this small homestead before whatever trial the coming waters would bring. The morning sky loomed gray and threatening as Margaret hung laundry, her movements quick against the rising wind. Náshdí had begun applying his mysterious sealant to the lower sections of the barn, a pungent mixture that smelled of pine and earth and something else she couldn't identify. He worked methodically, whispering what sounded like prayers as his hands moved across the wood. The distant sound of horses broke the rhythm of the day. Margaret turned toward the road, her heart sinking as she counted 3 riders approaching. The lead rider wore the unmistakable blue uniform of a cavalry officer, his posture rigid with authority. "Náshdí," she called in warning, though he had already ceased his work, watching the approaching men with stillness that reminded her of a deer sensing danger. The officer reined in his horse at her gate, the 2 civilians flanking him remaining slightly behind. He was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 30, with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes that had seen hard things. "Mrs. Thornton?" he asked, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "Lieutenant James Cooper, Fort Grant. May I have a word?" Margaret moved forward, positioning herself between the riders and the barn where Náshdí stood. "Of course, Lieutenant. What brings the army to my homestead?" Cooper dismounted in a fluid motion, handing his reins to one of his companions. A silver badge glinted on his chest, not standard army issue, but something personal. "I'm afraid there's a situation that requires my attention." His gaze shifted to Náshdí. "I see the reports were accurate." "Reports?" Margaret kept her voice steady. "We received word that an Apache man is residing on your property." Cooper's tone remained professional, but carried an unmistakable edge. "Given recent tensions and your vulnerable position as a widow, I felt it prudent to investigate personally." "That's very considerate, Lieutenant, but unnecessary. I hired Mr. Náshdí to repair my barn. He's been nothing but respectful and skilled." Cooper's jaw tightened slightly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you may not be aware of the risks. This particular Apache is known to us." Náshdí had moved closer now, his face impassive but his body alert. Cooper turned to address him directly. "Didn't expect to find you here, Náshdí. Last I heard, you were supposed to be at San Carlos with the rest of your band." "You know each other?" Margaret asked, surprised. "We've had dealings," Cooper replied grimly. 3 years ago, after the Canyon Creek incident." Náshdí met Cooper's gaze without flinching. "Lieutenant hunts Apache who leave reservation, even when hunting for food only." "I enforce the law," Cooper corrected sharply, "which states clearly that all Apache are to remain on designated reservations unless given explicit permission to leave." He turned back to Margaret. "Mrs. Thornton, this man is in violation of federal regulations simply by being here." "He's causing no harm," Margaret protested. "He's helping me prepare for the flooding that's coming." Cooper's eyebrow raised. "Flooding? It's barely rained in weeks." "There are signs," Margaret began, then stopped at Cooper's skeptical expression. How could she explain what she'd come to understand through Náshdí, the language of clouds, the behavior of animals, the subtle warnings that nature provided? "Signs," Cooper repeated flatly. Indian superstition, Mrs. Thornton. I'd have expected better from a woman of your standing. He sighed, softening his tone. Look, I understand. You needed help with repairs. Times are hard for a woman alone. But there are proper channels. A army could have arranged assistance. After how many months of paperwork? Margaret challenged. Winter is coming. I needed help now. Cooper's companions shifted uneasily on their horses. One of them, an older man with a weather-beaten face, spoke up. Lieutenant, those clouds to the west don't look natural. Maybe there's something to what the lady says. Cooper silenced him with a look before turning to Náshdí. You've put this woman in a difficult position. If you return to the reservation voluntarily, I can ensure there are no repercussions for her having harbored you. Harbored? Margaret's temper flared. He's an employee, not a fugitive. Under the law, ma'am, he is precisely that. Cooper's hand rested meaningfully on his holstered pistol. Any Apache off reservation without written authorization is considered hostile. Náshdí spoke quietly. Barn not finished. Protection not complete. Water coming soon. I don't give a damn about your superstitions. Cooper snapped, his professional veneer cracking slightly. I've seen what happens when settlers trust Apache prophecies. I've buried the results. The accusation hung in the air between them. Margaret looked from Cooper to Náshdí, sensing unspoken history. What is he talking about? Náshdí's expression remained dignified. Canyon Creek. White settlers trusted Apache water warning. Army said no danger. When flood came, Lieutenant blamed Apache for deaths. That's not what happened, Cooper said through clenched teeth. Your people lured those families away from Army protection with tales of flooding, then attacked them in the night. 23 dead, including women and children. A lie, Náshdí said simply. Apache tried to save. Army arrived too late, needed someone to blame. Cooper took a step toward Náshdí, his hand still on his weapon. I found the bodies myself. Don't tell me what I saw. Stop it, both of you. Margaret intervened. Lieutenant Cooper, I appreciate your concern, but Náshdí stays until my barn is complete. I take full responsibility. That's not how this works, Mrs. Thornton. Cooper's voice hardened. As an Army scout, I have the authority to remove any Apache found off reservation. However, he continued, glancing at the darkening sky, given the hour and weather, I'll allow you until tomorrow morning. He turned to Náshdí. First light, you either present yourself to me for escort back to San Carlos, or I return with more men. Is that understood? Náshdí nodded once, his face unreadable. Cooper replaced his hat, addressing Margaret again. Mrs. Thornton, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position. This man is not what he appears to be. I believe I'm a fair judge of character, Lieutenant, Margaret replied coolly. Good day to you. As the riders departed, tension lingered in the air like the electricity before a storm. Margaret turned to Náshdí, who had already moved back toward the barn. Is what he said true? About Canyon Creek? Náshdí's hands resumed their work with the sealant, but his eyes held a distant pain. Many truths, many lies. Canyon Creek was complicated. He looked toward the western sky. No time for old stories now. Water comes tomorrow, maybe next day. Must finish. Margaret wanted to press further, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Whatever had happened at Canyon Creek, whatever history lay between Náshdí and Lieutenant Cooper, it would have to wait. The coming flood wouldn't. Night fell with a natural swiftness as clouds thickened overhead. Margaret and Náshdí worked by lantern light, racing against both Cooper's deadline and the approaching storm. The silence between them had grown heavy, with unasked questions. Finally, as Náshdí carved protective symbols into a newly installed being, now doing so openly, rather than hiding his work, Margaret found her voice. Tell me about Canyon Creek, she said quietly, holding the lantern higher to illuminate his carving. I need to understand what happened between you and the lieutenant. Náshdí's hands paused, his knife hovering over the intricate spiral he was etching into the wood. For a long moment, Margaret thought he might not answer. Then he sighed, the sound barely audible above the wind outside. 3 summers ago. Dry season, then sudden heavy rains in mountains. His voice took on a storyteller's cadence. My people saw same signs we see now. I was not just tracker then, advisor to Chief Alcacé on water matters. You're more than a simple laborer, Margaret realized, pieces falling into place. You have standing among your people. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Once, yes. The smile faded. We knew flood would come to Canyon Creek. 3 settler families lived there. Good people who traded fairly with Apache. My chief sent me to warn them. Náshdí resumed his carving, the knife following paths worn by generations of practice. I told them danger. They believed, began packing wagons. His jaw tightened. Then Lieutenant Cooper arrived with soldiers. Side Apache planning raid, using flood story as trick. They didn't believe you, Margaret said softly. Army never believes Apache. Náshdí's voice carried no bitterness, only resignation. Cooper convinced families to stay, posted 2 soldiers as guards. I returned to my people, heart heavy. He completed the spiral with a final, precise cut. That night, water came. Not small flood wall of water, taller than barn. Canyon walls made it worse, like water in narrow pipe. His eyes met Margaret's. No one survived. Not settlers, not soldiers. But Cooper lived, Margaret observed. He came next day with more soldiers. Found destruction. Found bodies. Náshdí's voice lowered. Found Apache arrowhead near broken wagon. Decided Apache attacked before flood, then water washed away evidence. Did your people attack them? Margaret asked directly. No, Náshdí replied, his gaze steady. Arrowhead old, maybe from hunting years before, but Cooper needed someone to blame. Easier than accepting his mistake. Margaret considered his words, weighing them against Cooper's certainty. Why would he lie about something so terrible? Not lie in his mind, Náshdí said with surprising compassion. Man who cannot face his error makes different truth, believes it completely. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Náshdí looked toward the barn door. Rain starts. Not the flood yet, but it comes. Margaret set down the lantern and picked up a hammer. What will you do in the morning, when Cooper returns? If barn finished, I go with him, Náshdí said simply. No more trouble for you? And if it's not finished? Margaret pressed. If the protection isn't complete? Náshdí considered the question seriously. Then difficult choice. My freedom. Or your safety. He resumed work on another beam. Let us finish, then decide. They worked side by side through the evening, the pace grueling but necessary. As midnight approached, Náshdí began teaching Margaret the proper placement of the symbols, guiding her hand as she attempted her own carvings. Like this, he said, his hand covering hers to demonstrate the correct motion. Water symbol needs continuous line. No breaks for spirit to enter. The physical closeness would have been unthinkable days ago, but now felt natural to people, united in purpose. Margaret found herself wondering about Náshdí's life beyond what little he'd shared. Had there been a wife? Children? What circumstances had truly led him so far from his people? The sealant, she said as they moved to the next beam. You said it was a secret recipe passed down in your family. Náshdí nodded, mixing another batch in a wooden bowl. The smell of pine resin filled the air, mingling with other, more mysterious scents. Would you teach me? Margaret asked. Not because I expect to marry you, she added hastily, remembering his previous teasing, but because knowledge should be preserved, in case. She left the sentence unfinished, but they both understood. In case he was taken tomorrow. In case the flood proved worse than anticipated. In case this fragile connection between their worlds was severed. Náshdí studied her face in the lantern light. Then, without speaking, he gestured for her to kneel beside him at the bowl. Slowly, methodically, he began showing her the proportions. Pine resin collected from the north side of the tree, red clay from the creek bed, rendered fat that he had brought in his own supplies, and finally, a pinch of powder from his medicine. Pouch, crushed white sage, he explained. Sacred plant that purifies. Mixed with prayer. As she watched, he demonstrated the mixing technique, all the while speaking softly in Apache words she couldn't understand but recognized as something sacred. When he finished, he dipped his finger in the mixture and drew a small spiral on the back of her hand. Now you know, he said simply. Forbidden's knowledge, freely given. Margaret felt the weight of the gesture. Why show me, if it's forbidden's? Some rules must bend when worlds change, Náshdí replied. My grandfather said knowledge kept secret dies with last keeper. Knowledge shared lives forever. Rain began to fall in earnest outside, drumming against the newly reinforced roof. They both looked up, listening to the sound. It's holding, Margaret said with quiet satisfaction. Yes, Náshdí agreed. Your husband built good bones. We make them stronger. He touched the carved beam between them. Together, Apache and settler wisdom, stronger than either alone. In that moment, Margaret understood that whatever came with the morning Cooper's return, Náshdí's possible departure, the approaching flood, something fundamental had changed. A bridge had been built between separate worlds, as real and solid as the barn that sheltered them from the gathering storm. Sunday morning dawned with ominous calm. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean, but tense with anticipation. Despite Cooper's ultimatum and the work still remaining on the barn, Margaret had made the decision to attend church services. Absence would only fuel the town's speculation. I won't be gone long, she told Náshdí touched her. Though their spiritual paths differed, he respected the role faith played in her life. It was more consideration than many of her Christian neighbors had shown toward his beliefs. The small white church at the edge of Copper Springs stood as it always had, its modest steeple reaching toward heaven. Yet as Margaret approached, she sensed the difference immediately. Conversations halted as she neared. Greetings became stilted. Eyes followed her progress up the steps. Inside, Margaret took her usual seat halfway down the left side. For years, she and Thomas had occupied this exact spot each Sunday. After his death, the congregation had respectfully left the space beside her empty. Today, however, the pew remained conspicuously vacant on both sides, a physical manifestation of her sudden isolation. Only Sarah Collins broke the pattern, sliding in beside Margaret with a determined smile. Good morning, Mrs. Thornton. Beautiful day, isn't it? Before Margaret could respond, Sarah's father appeared at the end of the pew. Sarah, he hissed, come sit with the family. I'm fine here, Pa, Sarah replied, smoothing her skirts with deliberate nonchalance. Mr. Collins' face reddened. Now, girl, I won't ask again. Sarah hesitated, then squeezed Margaret's hand briefly before rising to follow her father. As they moved to the opposite side of the church, Margaret heard the whispers, poorly concealed behind hymn books and gloved hands. Double quotes. Harboring a savage. Lieutenant Cooper himself came. Pagan symbols all over her barn. Reverend Clark entered from the side door, his lean face solemn as he took his place at the pulpit. His eyes swept over the congregation, pausing briefly on Margaret before continuing. Let us pray, he intoned, and heads bowed dutifully. Familiar rhythm of the service provided little comfort today. When they rose to sing, Margaret noticed how those nearby seemed to lean away slightly, as if her presence had become contaminating. Only Mr. Abernathy from the general store offered a sympathetic nod when their eyes met during Amazing Grace. As Reverend Clark opened his Bible to begin his sermon, Margaret braced herself. The text was from Exodus, the plagues of Egypt, an unusual choice. And Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and the why. Fire ran along upon the ground, and the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt, the Reverend read, his voice rising dramatically. So there was hail, and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. His gaze found Margaret as he continued. God sends tribulations to test us, brothers and sisters. But more significantly, he sends them as warnings when we have strayed from his path. The message couldn't have been clearer had he named her directly. Margaret sat straight-backed, refusing to show discomfort as the sermon unfolded, a thinly veiled condemnation of those who might welcome foreign influences and pagan practices into a God-fearing community. We must ask ourselves, Reverend, Clark continued, his voice lowering conspiratorially, what judgments might befall us if we allow the corruption of heathen ways to take root among us? What floods of retribution might God send? Margaret's attention sharpened. Floods? Had word of Náshdí's warnings reached the Reverend? Or was it mere coincidence? There are those who might entertain strangers without realizing they entertain. Danger itself, he continued. Well-meaning souls led astray by false prophets who claimed to read signs and portents. Sheriff Mills shifted uncomfortably in his seat near the front, his eyes fixed on his boots. He'd clearly shared his observations. With the Reverend Dot as the sermon concluded and the final hymn began, Margaret remained seated while others rose around her. The words stuck in her throat. How could she sing praises alongside those who had just tacitly condemned her? When the service ended, Margaret moved quickly toward the door, hoping to avoid direct confrontation. Reverend Clark, however, positioned himself strategically in her path. Mrs. Thornton, he said, his voice carrying just far enough to ensure others would hear, I trust you found today's message illuminating. Perhaps we might speak privately about your ... situation. My situation is between me and the Lord, Reverend, Margaret replied evenly, as is your decision to use his pulpit to cast judgment. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby congregants. The Reverend's face hardened. Pride goeth before destruction, Mrs. Thornton. I pray you reconsider your path before it's too late. Speaking of paths, Mr. Abernathy interrupted, stepping forward unexpectedly. Margaret, might I walk with you? I've some information about those supplies you ordered. Grateful for the intervention, Margaret nodded. As they descended the church steps together, she noticed the congregation had divided into clusters, some watching her with open disapproval, others with uncertainty, and a few, like Sarah Collins, with what appeared to be reluctant admiration. Don't mind the Reverend, Abernathy said quietly as they walked. He means well, but sees the world in simpler terms than it truly is. Thank you for your kindness, Margaret replied. It seems in short supply lately, not as short as you might think. Abernathy glanced back toward the church. Sheriff Mills spoke to me yesterday. Mentioned strange clouds, possible flooding. Said your Apache had warned about it. Margaret nodded cautiously. Náshdí believes a serious flood is coming. Yes. The old-timers at the saloon are saying the same, Abernathy confided. Signs they haven't seen since '62, when half the valley flooded. The Reverend may call it superstition, but he shrugged meaningfully as they reached the edge of town. Margaret saw Sarah hurrying to catch up with them, her father calling after her, too. No avail. Mrs. Thornton, Sarah called, slightly breathless. I wanted to ask, is it true there might be flooding? Should we be preparing? Margaret looked between these two faces, perhaps the only allies she had left in Copper Springs, and made a decision. "Yes," she said firmly. "Náshdí believes the flood will come within days. Anyone who wishes to know more can come to my homestead this afternoon." It was a bold invitation that would either bridge the growing divide or widen it beyond repair. As she continued her journey home, Margaret wondered which souls would be brave enough to listen to wisdom from an unexpected source, and which would remain trapped in fear, disguised as righteousness. By mid-afternoon, Margaret had begun to regret her impulsive invitation. Náshdí worked furiously to complete the barn's protections, and Cooper would surely return by morning. The last thing they needed was curious or hostile visitors. Yet as she watched the road from her kitchen window, her worn barometer caught her eye. Thomas had treasured the brass instrument, checking it faithfully each morning. Since his death, Margaret had maintained the ritual. Today, the needle had dropped lower than she'd ever seen, the glass face fogging from the sudden pressure change. "Not working right," she murmured, tapping the glass. The needle didn't budge. A soft knock at the door interrupted her concern. Náshdí stood there, rainwater dripping from his hair despite the temporarily clear sky. "Need to show you something," he said, gesturing toward the creek that bordered her property to the east. They walked in silence to the water's edge. The usually placid creek had risen considerably, its surface carrying branches and debris from the foam. "Upstream, water rises without rain here," Náshdí explained. "Comes from mountains, first sign of big water." Margaret stared at the swollen creek. "How much time do we have? Maybe one day, maybe less." He pointed to the distant western peaks, now obscured by dark clouds. More rain there now, coming here soon. A flash of movement on the road caught Margaret's attention. 3 wagons approached, led by Mr. Abernathy's cart. Behind him came Sarah Collins in her father's buggy, and surprisingly, Sheriff Mills on horseback. "Your church friends come," Náshdí observed, his expression carefully neutral. "Not all friends," Margaret replied, "but perhaps not all enemies either." They walked back to meet the small procession as it entered her yard. Abernathy nodded respectfully to both of them, while Sarah practically bounced with nervous energy as she secured her horse. Sheriff Mills remained mounted, his eyes scanning the property with professional assessment. "Mrs. Thornton," Abernathy greeted her. "We've come about the flood warning." He glanced at Náshdí. "Thought we might hear more details." "I'm surprised to see you, Sheriff," Margaret said, addressing Mills directly. The lawman shifted in his saddle. "Official capacity, ma'am. Need to determine if there's a credible threat to public safety." Despite his formal tone, Margaret detected genuine concern behind his words. "Is Lieutenant Cooper with you?" she asked quietly. Mills shook his head. "Rode south to Fort Grant this morning. Said he'd return with reinforcements if needed." "A small reprieve, then." Margaret gestured toward the barn. "Náshdí can explain better than I. He's been reading the signs." The small group followed them into the barn, where the extent of their preparations was evident. Additional bracing reinforced the walls, carved symbols adorned strategic beams, and the lower sections gleamed with a special sealant. "What are those markings?" Sarah asked, touching one of the spirals with careful fingers. "Water paths," Náshdí explained, his limited English supplemented by gestures. "Show water where to go. Around, not through." Sheriff Mills frowned skeptically. "Markings can't stop water." "Not stop," Náshdí corrected. "Guide, like river banks guide river." Abernathy examined the reinforcements with a shopkeeper's practical eye. "Solid work, regardless of the symbols. This barn's stronger than most. Buildings in town now." "What convinces you there's flooding coming?" Mills asked directly. "Creek's up a bit, but that happens every year." Náshdí looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. He led them outside, pointing to the sky, the creek, the behavior of birds wheeling overhead in unusual patterns. He showed them anthills built unusually high, animal tracks all trending toward higher ground, and subtle changes in the color of distant clouds that suggested heavy precipitation in the mountain's dot. As he spoke, his English flowed more freely than Margaret had heard before, his evident knowledge commanding a respect that transcended cultural differences. Even Sheriff Mills listened with growing attention. When my grandfather was a boy, Náshdí explained, big water came like this. Old stories say it happens every few generations. Water spirits remind people they are powerful, demand respect. Water spirits? Mills repeated dubiously. Call it what you will, Sheriff, Abernathy interjected. Nature, God's will, spirits somethings, coming. My father saw the flood of 42, said there were signs just like these before it hit. Sarah had been examining the barometer Margaret had brought outside. Mrs. Thornton, is this broken? The needle's so low. I thought the same, Margaret replied. But after what Náshdí has shown us, ... Sheriff Mills dismounted finally, his decision apparently made. I've seen enough. If there's even a chance of flooding, the town needs warning. He turned to Náshdí with grudging respect. What preparations would you recommend? For the next hour, Náshdí outlined practical measures securing valuables in upper floors, preparing evacuation routes to higher ground, reinforcing foundations where possible. The group listened attentively, the earlier tension gradually giving way to collaborative planning. As they prepared to depart, Sheriff Mills approached Margaret privately. Lieutenant Cooper won't take kindly to this. He's convinced your Apache friend is dangerous. He has a name, Margaret replied. Náshdí, and he's trying to save lives, including Cooper's. Mills nodded slowly. I'll do what I can in town. Not everyone will listen, but some might. He glanced at the sky. Better hurry. Those clouds are moving faster than natural. After the visitors departed, Margaret and Náshdí returned to their work with renewed urgency. The creek had risen another inch just during the meeting. Will they believe? Náshdí asked as they secured the barn doors with additional bracing. Some will, Margaret replied. Maybe enough. As sunset approached, the western sky turned an unnatural greenish black. The air grew heavy, pressing against the skin like a physical weight. No birds sang in the trees. Even the insects had fallen silent. Margaret's broken barometer lay forgotten on the porch step. They didn't need instruments anymore to read what nature proclaimed with terrifying clarity. The flood was coming, and it would arrive before Lieutenant Cooper's return. Tonight, Náshdí said, looking toward the mountains. Big water comes tonight. Margaret surveyed their completed work, the reinforced barn, the house prepared as best they could manage, supplies moved to higher storage. They had done everything possible. Now they could only wait and hope that the wisdom of Náshdí's ancestors, combined with their own hard work, would be enough to withstand what was coming. Darkness fell with unnatural swiftness as Margaret and Náshdí completed their final preparations. They had moved her most valuable possessions to the barn's newly constructed loft, secured the livestock in the highest section of the stable, and stockpiled food and water. The wind had risen to a constant moan, bending the juniper trees like supplicants before an angry god. Should check creek once more, Náshdí said, wrapping a length of rope around his waist. If banks overflow, need to know which direction water comes first. Margaret nodded, securing the other end of the rope to the barn door. Don't go far. It's getting worse by the minute. As Náshdí disappeared into the gathering gloom, Margaret lit the storm lanterns around the barn's interior. The carved symbols on the beams caught the flickering light, seeming almost to move with a life of their own. She found herself tracing one of the spirals with her finger, silently offering a prayer that was neither entirely Christian nor entirely Apache, but something new born of her own desperate hope. The sudden pounding of hooves cut through the wind's howl. Margaret moved to the barn door, raising her lantern against the darkness. Her heart sank as Lieutenant Cooper emerged from the shadows, flanked by 4 soldiers. All were rain-soaked and grim-faced, their horses nervous in the rising storm. "Mrs. Thornton," Cooper called, dismounting with military precision despite the conditions. "Where is he?" "Lieutenant, this isn't the time," Margaret replied, raising her voice above the wind. "There's a flood coming. You and your men should seek higher ground immediately." Cooper's face hardened as he approached. "I've heard about this flood story. It spread through town like wildfire, causing panic, all because of your Apache's superstitions." "It's not superstition," Margaret insisted. "Look around you. The creek's already rising. The animals have fled to higher ground. The barometric pressure has dropped dramatically." "Classic fear tactics," Cooper dismissed. "Create panic, then exploit it. It's a pattern I've seen before." He gestured to his men. "Search the property. Find him." As the soldiers fanned out, Margaret blocked the barn entrance. "Lieutenant, I won't allow this. Náshdí has done nothing wrong except try to help this community prepare for a natural disaster." "Step aside, Mrs. Thornton," Cooper ordered. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." A flash of lightning illuminated the yard, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet. The storm was directly overhead now, the first heavy raindrops beginning to fall. "Cooper." Sheriff Mills' voice cut through the chaos as he rode into the yard, water streaming from his slicker. "Call off your men. We've got bigger problems." "Sheriff, this is Army business," Cooper replied coldly. "You have no jurisdiction here." "The hell I don't," Mills countered, dismounting. "This is my county, and I'm telling you there's a wall of water coming down from Apache Pass. Johnson's homestead at the north end of the valley is already underwater." Cooper hesitated, uncertainty briefly crossing his face. Another soldier approached from the direction of the creek, water sluicing from his uniform. "Lieutenant, the creek's risen 2 feet just since we arrived," he reported. "And there's a sound coming from upstream like a freight train, sir." Before Cooper could respond, Náshdí emerged from the darkness, the guide rope still tied around his waist. He froze momentarily at the sight of the soldiers, then addressed Margaret urgently. "Water comes fast now. Minutes, not hours." His gaze shifted to Cooper. "No time for fighting. Must get to high ground or barn." "There he is," Cooper shouted, drawing his pistol. "Private Jenkins, Private Morrow secure the prisoner." "Are you mad?" Margaret stepped between them. "Did you not hear what the sheriff said? There's a flood coming." Another lightning flash revealed the scene in stark relief. Cooper, with his pistol drawn, his men hesitating between conflicting duties. "Sheriff." Mills moving toward Náshdí with a wary but non-threatening posture. "Lieutenant," Mills said firmly, "I've seen the signs myself. This is real. We need to work together now, or none of us will live to sort this out later." A new sound became audible beneath the storm's fury, a distant roaring that raised the hair on the back of Margaret's neck. Náshdí's face grew solemn. "Too late for high ground," he said quietly. "Water comes now. Everyone inside barn. Only safe place." Cooper's face contorted with frustration and doubt. The roaring grew louder, unmistakable now, even to those who had never heard a flash flood before. "Lieutenant Cooper," Margaret said, meeting his eyes directly. "I received this from Army headquarters last month." She withdrew a folded paper from her pocket and thrust it toward him. "It's an official notice regarding my husband's military pension." "Open it." Cooper took the document reflexively, confusion momentarily replacing anger. "What does this have to do with—" "Read the signature." Margaret interrupted. "Who authorized my husband's posthumous benefits?" Cooper squinted at the paper in the dim light. "Colonel William Thornton, Department of... He looked up sharply. You're related to Colonel Thornton? My brother-in-law, Margaret confirmed. Thomas's older brother. Now, Lieutenant, you have approximately 30 seconds to decide whether you want to explain to a full colonel why his widowed sister-in-law drowned during your attempt to arrest someone who was trying to save her life. The ultimatum hung in the air between them, punctuated by another thunderous crack and the steadily increasing roar from the creek. Cooper's jaw worked as he processed this unexpected complication. All men inside the barn, he finally ordered, holstering his weapon. Secure the horses in the stable section. Move. The soldiers scrambled to obey as the first surge of water appeared at the edge of the property, not a gentle rising, but a churning wall carrying debris and uprooted trees before it. Náshdí, Margaret called urgently. Will the barn hold? There. Eyes met across the chaos of men and horses rushing for shelter. We will see, he replied simply. Now we trust the spirits. And your Christian God, too. As they retreated into the barn, Cooper paused beside Margaret. This doesn't change anything, he said, voice low and tense. When the water recedes, he's still coming with me. If we survive, Margaret replied, you're welcome to try. The barn doors closed against the storm, just as the first surge of floodwater swept across the yard, the carved symbols and pine resin sealant about to face their ultimate test. The first impact of water against the barn sounded like a battering ram. The walls shuddered but held as muddy water began seeping beneath the doors. Inside, lantern light cast long shadows across anxious-faced soldiers positioned near Cooper. Margaret and Sheriff Mills standing with Náshdí, the horses whinnying nervously in their stalls. Barricade the doors, Cooper ordered his men, practical. Necessity temporarily overriding his hostility. As two soldiers dragged hay bales against the doors. Náshdí moved methodically around the barn's perimeter, checking his protective measures. The carved symbols seemed to capture the lantern light, glowing faintly against the darkened wood. Will your reinforcements hold? Sheriff Mills asked, watching as water began pooling on the packed earth floor. Barn was built well, Náshdí replied. Symbols guide water around, not through. If wood obeys, we stay dry. Cooper scoffed from across the barn. If wood obeys? Do you hear yourselves? Talking about magic carvings while we're in the middle of a natural disaster. Another surge struck the barn, stronger than the first. Timbers creaked ominously, but the structure remained solid. Through a small window, Margaret caught glimpses of the world outside, illuminated by lightning, a churning sea where her yard had been. Debris racing past on the current, the shadowy outline of her house with water already reaching its porch. My God, Mills whispered beside her. Johnson's place, the Millers, the Hendersons, they're all downstream. If this is hitting us this hard ... Margaret's thoughts went to Sarah Collins and Mr. Abernathy. Had they heeded the warnings? Had they reached higher ground in time? A sharp crack overhead drew everyone's attention. Water had found its way through the roof at one corner, streaming down in a steady flow. Cooper's youngest soldier, barely more than a boy, looked up with naked fear. The roof's giving way, he said, voice cracking. We're going to drown in here. Steady, Private, Cooper commanded, though Margaret noted the concern in his own eyes as he assessed the breach. Náshdí moved to the leaking corner, examining it carefully. Not failure, he said after a moment. Planned path. He pointed, too. A series of symbols carved into the nearby beam, then to a drainage channel barely visible in the floor. Water comes in here, follows path out there. Pressure relief. As if confirming his words, the water streaming from above indeed followed the carved channel in the floor, disappearing through a small outlet rather than spreading across the barn. You designed it to leak? Cooper asked incredulously. No building. Keeps all water out during great flood, Náshdí explained with unexpected patience. Secret is controlling where water enters, where it leaves, like river banks. The logic was undeniable as they watched the controlled flow. One of Cooper's men ventured closer, examining the drainage system with reluctant admiration. "Lieutenant," he said, "the Apache's right. It's working like irrigation channels back home." Outside, the roar of the flood reached deafening levels. The entire barn vibrated with the force of water surging around it. Through the windows, they could see other structures in the distance, beginning to fail, fences torn away, a small outbuilding collapsing, trees bending until their roots tore free from the saturated earth. "My house," Margaret whispered, watching. As water rose to the windowsills of her home, Náshdí moved to her side. "House may stand, may not. Things can be rebuilt. Lives cannot." A thunderous crash outside sent everyone ducking instinctively. When they looked up, the window revealed that Margaret's house had partially collapsed, its western wall giving way to the flood's relentless pressure. "Thomas built that house," Margaret said, her voice tight with emotion. "And this barn," Náshdí reminded her gently. "His best work saves us now." Shouts outside somehow carried above the storm's fury. Mills rushed to the window, peering into the darkness. "There's someone out there." Through the rain and chaos, Margaret made out figures on what had been the road, a wagon half submerged, people clinging to its elevated side as water threatened to sweep it away. "It's the Collins family," she gasped, recognizing Sarah's distinctive blue dress even in the dim light. Their wagon must have been caught in the flood. Cooper joined them at the window, his training overriding all other concerns. "They won't last long in that current. The wagon could flip any minute." Without hesitation, Náshdí began uncoiling the rope from around his waist, the same one he'd used earlier to check the creek. "Need more rope," he said urgently. "Can reach them from barn roof." "That's suicide," Cooper protested. "The roof's barely holding as it is." "Roof will hold," Náshdí insisted. "Designed to be strongest part." A silent communication passed between the Apache and the lieutenant. Mutual assessment from men accustomed to life and death decisions. Something shifted in Cooper's expression. "Jenkins, Morrow, get every rope we have," he ordered. "Saddle, ropes, picket lines, everything." As the soldiers hurried to comply, Cooper turned to Náshdí. "I'll go with you. 2 anchor points are better than 1. Margaret watched in astonishment as the 2 men, adversaries minutes before, began quickly knotting ropes together. Sheriff Mills organized the remaining soldiers into a human chain to serve as anchors. "Mrs. Thornton," Cooper said as he tested the strength of their improvised rescue line, "we'll need lanterns positioned at the window and loft door to guide us back." "Of course," she nodded, already moving to adjust the lights. Náshdí touched her arm as she passed. "If barn fails while we're outside, ... It won't," Margaret said with certainty. "The symbols will hold. The wood will obey." A faint smile touched his lips at hearing his own words repeated with such conviction. As the men prepared to climb to the loft and onto the roof, Margaret realized that something profound had shifted inside the barn. The floodwaters outside had somehow washed away the artificial boundaries between them settler and Apache, military and civilian, authority and outcast. In the face of nature's overwhelming force, they had become simply human beings united by the most basic instinct, survival. More than that, they had become a community bound by something stronger than fear or prejudice. As Cooper and Náshdí disappeared into the loft access, Margaret recognized what that something was. It was hope not just to survive themselves, but to extend that survival to others in need, regardless of prior differences. Outside, the waters continued to rise, testing the physical strength of the barn. Inside, something even more powerful had begun to take hold. Dawn broke, with muted light filtering through the barn's small windows. The roar of floodwaters had diminished to a steady rush, and for the first time in hours, voices didn't need to be raised to be heard. Margaret moved among the survivors, distributing blankets and mugs of hot coffee brewed over a small fire, carefully maintained in an old metal wash tub. The rescue had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Not only had Cooper and Náshdí managed to bring in the Collins family Sarah, her father, and 2 younger brothers, but they'd subsequently spotted and saved the Millers from the young roof of their collapsing house. Mr. Abernathy had arrived under his own power, half swimming and half floating on a makeshift raft fashioned from his store's wooden sign. Now 17 people crowded the barn's interior: soldiers, townspeople, and 1 Apache, all drawn together by disaster and the strange sanctuary of Margaret's barn, the only structure visible above the floodwaters for as far as they could see. "It's a miracle this barn still stands," Mr. Collins said, his earlier prejudice noticeably absent as he accepted a steaming mug from Margaret. "Everything else is just gone." "Not miracle," Náshdí said quietly, from where he sat mending a torn section of rope. "Preparation, good building, respect for water's power." Cooper, his uniform still damp from the night's efforts, leaned against a support beam nearby. The carved symbols were clearly visible beside his shoulder, but he no longer seemed troubled by their presence. "I've seen floods before," he admitted, "but nothing like this. Without this barn... He left the sentence unfinished. The implication clear. Sarah Collins approached with a large woolen blanket, offering it to an elderly Mrs. Miller who shivered despite the coffee warming her hands. "Here," she said gently. "This should help." Mrs. Miller looked up with tearful gratitude. "But won't you be cold, dear?" "We can share," Sarah suggested, settling beside the older woman and drawing the blanket around both their shoulders. "There's plenty enough." Across the barn, similar scenes unfolded as the survivors huddled together regardless of previous social divisions. One of Cooper's soldiers shared his rations with Mr. Abernathy. Sheriff Mills helped Mr. Miller bandage a gash on his arm. 2 children played quietly with carved wooden animals Náshdí had produced from his pocket. Margaret paused in her distribution of provisions, struck by the transformation before her. The same people who had shunned her in church just days ago now sat shoulder to shoulder in her barn, their lives preserved by the very pagan symbols they had condemned. "You were right," she said softly, as Náshdí joined her by the coffee pot. "About everything." He shook his head slightly. "Not everything. Did not know barn would save so many. Good surprise." A commotion at the window drew their attention. Cooper stood with his field glasses, surveying the flooded valley in the strengthening morning light. "The water's receding," he announced. "Slowly, but definitely dropping. I can see the road again in places." "What about the town?" Sheriff Mills asked, joining him. Cooper adjusted his glasses. "Hard to tell from this distance. Some buildings still standing. The church steeple is visible, and what looks like the saloon." He continued scanning. The creek's carved a new channel through the center of Main Street. Everything east of that appears to be gone. A murmur ran through the gathered survivors' relief, mingled with dawning comprehension of the devastation's extent. "Our homes," Mrs. Miller whispered. "All our things... Things can be rebuilt," Mr. Collins said, unconsciously echoing Náshdí's words from the night before. "We're alive because of... He faltered, looking toward the Apache with a complex expression, gratitude wrestling with a lifetime of prejudice. "Because of Náshdí's warning," Margaret completed for him. "And because he taught me how to prepare this barn to withstand the flood." All eyes turned to Náshdí, who received their attention with quiet dignity. Cooper cleared his throat. "As an army officer, I'm obliged to acknowledge effective strategy when I see it," he said formally. "Your... methods saved lives, American lives." "Apache lives too," Náshdí replied simply. Water does not see difference. The profound truth of this statement settled over the group. Sarah Collins suddenly stood, drawing the shared blanket more securely around Mrs. Miller's shoulders. "He's right," she said with youthful conviction. The flood didn't care who was settler and who was Apache. Neither did the barn when it sheltered us all. She looked around the circle of faces. Maybe we shouldn't care so much about those differences either. A charged silence followed her words. Then Mr. Abernathy spoke up from his corner. "My store's likely gone, but I've got supplies cached in the hills." Always prepared for Apache raids, truth be told. He glanced apologetically at Náshdí. Ironic that it'll now help us all rebuild, Apache wisdom having saved our lives. "We'll need every hand when the waters recede," Sheriff Mills added. Every bit of knowledge, too, whether it came from back east or from the Apache traditions. Cooper had been watching this exchange with an unreadable expression. Now he straightened, military bearing reasserting itself. "Once communications are re-established, I'll need to report to my superiors." His eyes met Náshdí's. "The official record will show that you are working within settlement boundaries with permission, providing critical assistance during a natural disaster." The implication was clear. Cooper would not be arresting Náshdí for being off the reservation. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a beginning dot as morning advanced. The floodwaters continued their slow retreat, revealing a transformed landscape. The barn stood like an island in a sea of mud and debris, the only structure for miles. That remained completely intact. From the loft window, Margaret surveyed what had been her homestead. The collapsed house, uprooted trees, fields scoured clean of topsoil. Yet amid the destruction, she felt a strange sense of possibility. Beside her, Náshdí watched the same. Seeing, his expression thoughtful. "Water destroys," he said quietly, "but also makes things new. Brings different seeds, different soil. Changes what can grow." Margaret nodded, understanding he spoke of more than just the physical landscape. In the barn below, former adversaries now worked together, planning recovery efforts. Their previous divisions washed away as surely as the boundaries between properties. Something new had indeed begun to grow in the aftermath of the flood, something that might never have taken root without the destruction that preceded it. By late afternoon, the floodwaters had receded enough to reveal muddy pathways between remaining structures. Cooper and his men had departed to assess damage in town and establish contact with the fort, while Sheriff Mills organized the first recovery efforts from the barn that had become their command center. Margaret stood in what remained of her vegetable garden, surveying the damage. The rich soil she'd tended for years had been scoured away, replaced by strange deposits, river stones, broken branches, and oddly fertile silt that might actually improve next season's planting. Destruction and renewal, just as Náshdí had described. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where a group of riders approached from the east, the direction of the Apache reservation. Margaret tensed, uncertain what this new development might bring. Náshdí emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the late afternoon sun. As he recognized the approaching riders, something subtle shifted in his bearing. A straightening of his shoulders, a lift of his chin. He moved to stand beside Margaret as the group drew closer. 5 Apache men rode in formation, their horses carefully picking through mud and debris. Unlike the ragged stereotype of reservation Indians that townsfolk feared, these men wore a mixture of traditional dress and practical adaptations, one even sporting a cavalry-style hat that had clearly seen better days. All carried themselves with unmistakable dignity. The leader, a man of perhaps 50 with a face mapped by experience, raised his hand in greeting. Náshdí returned the gesture, then surprised Margaret by speaking rapidly in Apache, more words than she'd heard from him at once since they'd met. The older man dismounted, revealing a silver medallion hanging at his chest, intricately worked, metal that caught the sunlight as he approached. The others remained on horseback, their expressions respectful but wary as they surveyed the flood damage. "Margaret," Náshdí said, switching to English, "this is Dainty al-Ashi Y, my mother's cousin, chief of our band at San Carlos." Margaret tried to hide her surprise at both the introduction and Náshdí's suddenly improved English. "Welcome," she managed, inclining her head respectfully. "The woman who sheltered Náshdí," the chief acknowledged, his English heavily accented, but clear. "You have our gratitude." "Your ... gratitude?" Margaret repeated, confused by the formality. Before anyone could elaborate, Sheriff Mills and several townspeople emerged from the barn, their expressions guarded at the sight of the Apache delegation. "Mrs. Thornton," Mills called, moving quickly to her side. "Everything all right here?" "Yes, Sheriff," she assured him. "These men are from the San Carlos reservation. They're—" She looked to Náshdí, uncertain how to explain what she didn't fully understand herself. "They have come for—" Náshdí said simply. The chief spoke again, addressing his words to both Margaret and the sheriff. "When great waters came to our lands, we feared for Náshdí. He left many days ago after dream vision showed flood would threaten settlements here." "Dream vision?" Mills repeated skeptically. The chief regarded him steadily. "Our people have watched water patterns for many generations, Sheriff. Náshdí is our most skilled reader of such signs. When he dreamed of danger to this valley, our council gave him permission to bring warning." Margaret turned to Náshdí, pieces falling into place. "You didn't leave the reservation without permission. You were sent here." A ghost of a smile touched Náshdí's lips. "Not exactly sent, allowed to follow vision." "But you were starving when you arrived," Margaret pressed. "You needed work," the chief answered before Náshdí could respond. "He chose to come as humble worker, not as what he truly is among our people." "And what is that?" Sheriff Mills asked directly. The chief touched the medallion at his chest. "Náshdí is medicine man of our band, spiritual leader. His grandfather was peace chief who signed first treaty with white government." Pride colored his voice. "Also, he is my successor, future chief of our people." A collective murmur rose from the gathered townspeople. Margaret stared at Náshdí in astonishment, seeing him suddenly in a new light. Not a desperate laborer or skilled craftsman, but a leader, a man of significant standing who had chosen to appear humble for reasons she couldn't yet fathom. "Is this true?" she asked quietly. Náshdí nodded, something apologetic in his expression. "Truth has many layers. I am what he says. Also what you know, man who fixes roofs." The sound of more horses interrupted the revelation. Lieutenant Cooper returned with his men, his expression darkening at the sight of the Apache delegation. "What's happening here?" he demanded, dismounting swiftly. "Sheriff, explain this gathering." Before Mills could answer, the chief stepped forward, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Lieutenant Cooper." "We meet again." Cooper froze, staring at the chief, then at Náshdí with dawning comprehension. "You're from Chief T.L. Ashy Eyes Band, the peace faction." His gaze fixed on Náshdí with new intensity. "You were at the treaty negotiations 2 years ago." "Yes," Náshdí acknowledged simply. "But you were dressed differently, spoke perfect English, called yourself many names for same man," Náshdí interrupted. "To my people, I am Náshdí, he who guides. To army translators, I was David Songbird." He gestured to the barn and the flood-ravaged landscape. "Here, I was simply man who knew about water and wood." Cooper's face reflected complex emotions, confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been embarrassment. "You sat across from General Howard at those negotiations. You spoke for your entire tribe about water rights." His voice hardened. "And you let me believe you were just some renegade off the reservation." "You believed what you expected to see," Náshdí replied without accusation. I became what was needed here, not negotiator, not chief's son, but worker with useful skills. The chief addressed Cooper directly. My kinsman had vision of flood that would destroy this valley. Council granted him leave to warn settlers. He chose method that would be accepted. By hiding his identity? Cooper challenged. Would you have believed flood warning from Apache chief's son? Náshdí asked quietly. Or accepted protection symbols carved by medicine man? Or would you have seen plot, deception, threat? Cooper had no immediate answer, the truth of the question evident to all present. Margaret's mind raced, reevaluating every interaction since Náshdí had first appeared at her gate. The careful broken English that had gradually improved. The deep knowledge he'd revealed in measured doses. The skills of a craftsman combined with the wisdom of a spiritual leader. You could have told me, she said softly. Náshdí met her eyes. You hired man to fix roof. That man helped you. Truth grew between us as trust grew. He gestured to the barn, still standing proud amid devastation. Result would be same. Lives saved. From the larger group of townspeople, Sarah Collins stepped forward, her practical nature cutting through the tension. Well, I for one am glad he came, however he did it. My family would be dead otherwise. She looked around at the gathered faces, challenge in her young eyes. Doesn't seem right to question the manner of our salvation, does it? 2 days after the flood, Margaret's barn hosted an unprecedented gathering. Around a large table fashioned from salvaged lumber sat representatives from 2 worlds that had existed in mutual suspicion for generations. Town leaders on one side, Apache elders on the other, with Margaret and Náshdí positioned symbolically. Between them, before them lay a crude map drawn on a piece of canvas, the most detailed rendering they could manage of the altered landscape. Copper Springs had survived partially intact, with buildings on higher ground largely spared. The eastern portion of town, however, had been scoured away, along with scattered homesteads throughout the valley. The creek itself had carved a new channel, rendering previous property boundaries meaningless in many areas. Rebuilding as things were makes no sense, Sheriff Mills explained, tracing the new creek path with his finger. Nature's redrawn the map for us. Chief Teal Al-Ashy nodded thoughtfully. Water finds true path. Fighting against, it brings more trouble later. Cooper, who had remained in the valley to coordinate military assistance, studied the map with professional detachment. The Army can provide limited supplies from Fort Grant, but reconstruction is largely your responsibility. Washington won't allocate significant resources for a settlement this size. Then we must be clever with what we have, Mr. Abernathy said. He had emerged as a practical voice among the townspeople, his merchant's mind quickly assessing their collective inventory of salvaged goods. Every nail, every board counts now. Apache people offer help, the chief said, earning surprised. Looks from several townspeople. We have skilled hunters who can provide meat while you rebuild. Women who can help preserve food for coming winter. Men who know building methods suited to this land. Reverend Clark, who had been notably silent until now, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Chief, why would your people help us? We've hardly been welcoming. The question hung in the air, its honesty refreshing after years of polite hostility. The chief exchanged glances with Náshdí before answering. For many reasons, he said carefully. First, because helping those in need is right path. Second, because what affects this valley affects all who live near it. He paused. And third, because Náshdí believes your people and mine might find better way forward together. An alliance, Cooper stated flatly. That's what you're proposing. Alliance, the chief repeated, tasting the word. Yes, not treaty written on paper that neither side respects. Real alliance built on work done together. Margaret watched the town council members exchange uneasy glances. Mr. Collins, who had lost his home entirely, was the first to speak. "My family's alive because an Apache warned us and helped build a barn strong enough to withstand that flood," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Seems to me we'd be fools to reject their help now. But working alongside Indians?" Mrs. Hollister objected, her customary judgmental tone somewhat subdued by recent events. "Living in proximity? There are concerns." "What concerns exactly, Eunice?" Sarah Collins challenged, standing behind her father. "That we might learn something useful? That our children might grow up without the fear we were taught?" "Young lady," Reverend Clark admonished, "this is a complex matter requiring careful consideration of what?" Sarah interrupted. "I was taught Indians were savages. Then I watched Lieutenant Cooper and Náshdí risk their lives together to save my family. I saw Apache medicine stop my brother's bleeding when he was injured. What exactly should I carefully consider about people who've done nothing but help us?" Her impassioned words created a moment of uncomfortable reflection. Margaret seized the opportunity to direct attention back to the map. "The practical reality is this," she said firmly. "Winter comes whether we're ready or not. Alone, neither community has enough resources to fully recover before the first snow. Together, we might." Náshdí spoke for the first time in the meeting, his English now fluent and precise. "Apache winter homes use half the wood of settler cabins, but retain heat better. Our methods of food storage require no metal or glass. Our hunting techniques waste nothing." He gestured to the map. "We offer knowledge earned over many generations in this land. You offer tools and materials we lack. Together, we can build something stronger than before." The logic was difficult to refute, especially with winter approaching and resources limited. Even the most skeptical town council members found themselves considering the practical benefits of cooperation. Reverend Clark raised another concern. "And when the Army orders your people back to the reservation, what then?" Cooper shifted uncomfortably. "There's some flexibility in those regulations, particularly after natural disasters." He looked at Náshdí. "If I were to report that Apache assistance was essential to preventing loss of American lives and property, temporary residency permissions could be arranged." "Temporary?" Chief T.L. Ashi questioned. "One step at a time, honored father," Náshdí said in Apache before switching back to English. "Let us begin with what's possible now. Trust grows like strong tree from small seed with patience." Margaret watched understanding dawn across various faces. The practical wisdom of this approach, penetrating even the most entrenched prejudices. Mr. Abernathy was already scribbling notes about resource allocation. Sheriff Mills and Cooper had begun discussing security arrangements for a mixed community. Even Reverend Clark appeared thoughtful rather than opposed. "I suggest we start with immediate needs," Margaret proposed. "Shelter, food, clean water. Form mixed work groups with both Apache and settler members, each focused on specific tasks." "Wise approach," the chief agreed. "My people can begin teaching winter-proofing techniques immediately. Show how to make warm homes with less wood. And our men can help clear debris with the horses and equipment that survived," Mills added. As the discussion evolved into specific planning, Margaret felt Náshdí's hand briefly touch hers beneath the table, a small gesture of acknowledgement. She glanced at him, seeing both satisfaction and caution in his eyes. This fragile alliance was just beginning, its future far from certain. "It will not be easy," he said quietly as the others continued planning. "Old fears run deep on both sides." "But the flood washed away some barriers," Margaret replied. "Revealed what matters most." "Yes," he agreed. "Water destroys, but also makes clean. New growth comes after." Around them, former adversaries now bent over the map together, fingers tracing possible locations for shared resources, temporary shelters, and eventually, permanent structures that would incorporate wisdom. From both traditions, the barn that had sheltered them through disaster now witnessed the first tentative blueprints of a community reimagined, not as separate peoples tolerating each other, but as neighbors building something unprecedented together. 3 weeks after the flood, the valley had transformed in ways few could have imagined. Where destruction had ruled, organized cooperation now flourished. Mixed teams of settlers and Apache worked side by side clearing debris, salvaging materials, and raising new structures using combined techniques that honored both traditions. Margaret's barn remained their command center, but the town hall had been their first major reconstruction project, a symbol of their new shared governance. Unlike the original structure with its purely Western design, the new hall incorporated Apache principles for heat retention and natural cooling, with carved support beams that married practical engineering with spiritual protection. Margaret wiped sweat from her brow as she helped Sarah Collins and 2 Apache women hang drying racks for winter meat storage. The easy rhythm of their collaboration still occasionally struck her as miraculous. Just a month ago, such cooperation would have seemed impossible. Margaret! Sheriff Mills called, approaching with unusual urgency. Army wagon coming. Looks like brass from Fort Grant. She felt a flutter of concern. Lieutenant Cooper had departed 3 days earlier, summoned back to the fort after his extended stay in the valley. They'd feared his reports might draw unwanted attention from his superiors, who might not view the alliance with the same practical flexibility. Warn Náshdí and the chief, Margaret instructed. I'll greet them. By the time the military wagon rolled into the center of their work area, Náshdí had joined Margaret, with Chief T.L. Ashiui close behind. The Apache workers continued their tasks but positioned themselves strategically closer to their leaders. A gray-haired colonel descended from the wagon, followed by Cooper and 2 other officers. The colonel's eyes widened as he surveyed the scene, Apache and settlers working together. New buildings featuring obvious influences from both cultures. Women from both communities engaged in food preparation as equals. Lieutenant Cooper, the colonel said without taking his eyes from the scene, I see your reports were not exaggerated. No, sir, Colonel Ashford, Cooper replied stiffly. Mrs. Thornton? The colonel inquired, turning to Margaret. She stepped forward. I am. Welcome to our valley, Colonel. Your valley, he repeated with emphasis. I was under the impression this was a territorial settlement under United States jurisdiction, not an independent ... double quotes. He searched for the appropriate word ... experiment. The flood changed many things, Colonel, Margaret replied evenly, including our understanding of survival in this territory. The colonel's gaze shifted to Náshdí and the chief. And you must be the Apache leaders I've heard about. You're a considerable distance from San Carlos Reservation. By permission. Náshdí replied in perfect English. Lieutenant Cooper authorized our temporary residency to assist with disaster recovery. Did he now? The colonel's tone made clear that Cooper's authority in this matter was precisely what he'd come to investigate. Lieutenant Cooper was dispatched to apprehend Apache individuals off reservation without authorization. Instead, I find he's facilitated some sort of ... integration. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Sheriff Mills stepped forward. Colonel, with respect, without the Apache assistance, we'd be burying our dead instead of rebuilding our town. Commendable humanitarian aid, one of the other officers interjected, but hardly justification for ongoing residency outside reservation boundaries. The policy is clear and comes directly from Washington. Perhaps Washington doesn't understand our situation, Margaret suggested. The flood destroyed traditional boundaries. We're rebuilding something stronger by working together. Colonel Ashford's expression hardened. Mrs. Thornton, settlement policy isn't determined by local preference. These Apache individuals must return to the reservation immediately. Any who refuse will be forcibly removed. A murmur of protest rose from the gathered workers. The colonel raised his hand for silence. Additionally, Lieutenant Cooper will face disciplinary review for exceeding his authority. This unauthorized arrangement ends today. Cooper stepped forward, his military bearing impeccable despite the obvious tension. Sir, I request permission to speak. Granted, though I doubt it will change matters. Colonel, my initial mission was indeed to return unauthorized Apache individuals to the reservation. However, upon arriving, I encountered extraordinary circumstances that required immediate judgment. Cooper gestured to the rebuilt structures around them. What you see here isn't some idealistic experiment. It's practical survival implemented by people who have discovered their mutual dependence. Dependence? The colonel questioned skeptically. Yes, sir. The Apache knowledge of local conditions saved countless lives during the flood. Their building techniques have allowed us to construct shelters with half the timber, critical when supplies are limited. Meanwhile, our tools and technologies have benefited their people. Cooper straightened. As an Army officer, I made a tactical decision that this cooperation served the territory's interests better than forced separation. The colonel appeared unmoved. Noble sentiments, Lieutenant, but they don't change policy. Perhaps this will. Margaret interjected, retrieving a document from inside the town hall. This arrived by courier yesterday. It's from Colonel William Thornton, Department of Western Territories. The colonel's eyebrows rose. Thornton? What's his interest here? I'm his sister-in-law, Margaret explained, handing over the document. I wrote to him about our situation. Colonel Ashford scanned the letter, his expression shifting from dismissive to concerned. This is a provisional authorization for an experimental cooperative settlement, signed by General Howard himself. My brother-in-law was at the peace negotiations with the Apache 2 years ago, Margaret explained. He recognized the potential benefits of what we've started here. The colonel looked up sharply. This is highly irregular. As was the flood, Náshdí observed quietly. Irregular times require new thinking. Chief T.L. Ashi stepped forward, his dignity commanding attention. Colonel, our people have lived under your government's restrictions for many years. We have followed rules that change with each new white leader. Now we ask only to build something that benefits both our peoples. It's not that simple, the colonel protested, though with less conviction. Actually, it is, Mr. Collins interrupted, joining the conversation. I lost everything in that flood home, fields, livestock. The only reason my family survived was Apache warning and Apache knowledge. He gestured to the partially completed structure behind him. That's my new home. Built with Apache heat retention methods that'll save me half my winter firewood. You tell me why I should support sending away the people who are helping us survive. Others joined in Mr. Abernathy, describing improved food preservation techniques. Sarah Collins demonstrating a water filtration system developed collaboratively. Sheriff Mills reporting the complete absence of conflicts between the communities. Colonel found himself facing not just Apache leadership, but a united front of settlers equally committed to the alliance. I need to inspect these arrangements more thoroughly before making any determination, he finally conceded. Of course, Margaret agreed. We welcome your inspection. Please start with the town hall, our first major project combining both building traditions. As the colonel and his officers were led toward the structure, Cooper remained behind with Margaret and Náshdí. This isn't over, he warned quietly. Colonel Ashford has orders, and he follows them. Then we must convince him that new orders are needed, Náshdí replied. Show him value that cannot be denied. Margaret watched as the colonel examined the town hall's construction. His professional interest clearly piqued despite his resistance. Every beam, every joint in that building tells our story, she said. The flood forced us together. What we've built since has been by choice. The next hours would determine whether their fragile alliance would be sanctioned or destroyed, whether the transformation born in disaster could take permanent root or would be uprooted by policies created far from the realities of their lives. 1 year later, autumn sunshine bathed the valley in golden light as preparations for the flood memorial celebration reached their final stages. Margaret stood in the doorway of her new home, marveling at the transformation before her. Where destruction had once reigned, a thriving community now flourished, one unlike any other in the Arizona Territory. The settlement, now officially recognized as Harmony Creek on territorial maps, bore little resemblance to the rigidly segregated communities typical of the frontier. Adobe structures with pitched roofs stood alongside traditional wooden buildings weatherproofed with pine resin sealant. Gardens combining European vegetables with native plants flourished in the fertile silt deposited by the flood. Children from both cultures played together in the schoolyard, switching effortlessly between English and Apache phrases. Above, Margaret's door hung a carved wooden lintel, a wedding gift from Chief T.L. Akshay. The intricate design incorporated both Apache water spirals and Christian crosses, symbols of the two traditions that had somehow found common ground in this unlikely place. "It's almost time," Sarah Collins called, approaching with a basket of fresh bread. Now the school's teacher, Sarah had blossomed into a confident young woman, her natural openness making her the perfect bridge between cultures for the settlement's children. "Is everything ready at the barn?" Margaret asked, accepting the basket. "Absolutely. Mr. Abernathy's handling the food with Two Rivers' wife. The musicians are practicing together. You should hear Jenkins playing violin alongside the Apache drummers. It's surprisingly beautiful." They walked together toward the center of the settlement where Margaret's barn, the genesis of everything that followed, had been preserved, exactly as it stood during the flood. Now surrounded by new construction, it served as both memorial and meeting place, its carved symbols visible reminders of the wisdom that had saved them all. "Lieutenant Cooper arrived about an hour ago," Sarah mentioned casually. "He brought news from Fort Grant." Margaret raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Good news, I think," Sarah continued. "He seemed pleased. Said he'd wait to announce it at the celebration." Cooper's support had proved crucial during Colonel Ashford's inspection a year earlier. Against expectations, the lieutenant had risked his career to testify about the practical benefits of their alliance. His eloquent defense, combined with the undeniable evidence of their successful cooperation, had eventually convinced the colonel to support a 1-year experimental authorization for their integrated settlement. Now the year had passed, and their future hung once again in the balance of military and government assessment. As they neared the barn, Margaret spotted Náshdí directing preparations for the ceremonial fire. Their eyes met across the distance, and his solemn expression softened into a smile that still made her heart quicken. Their relationship had evolved gradually over the past year, from employer and worker to allies to friends, and finally to something deeper that bridged cultural divides as surely as their community did. Their wedding 3 months ago, conducted with elements from both traditions, had symbolized for many the true integration they were building together. "Margaret." Sheriff Mills called, approaching with official papers in hand. "The last supply wagon just arrived from Tucson, and the territorial governor's representative confirmed he'll be here tomorrow." "Excellent," Margaret nodded. "Everything must be perfect for his inspection." The governor's assessment would determine whether their experimental status would be extended, formalized, or revoked entirely. They had spent months documenting their successes, agricultural yields improved by combined techniques, illness rates reduced by integrated medical practices, and most importantly, the complete absence of the conflicts that had previously defined Apache settler relations. By late afternoon, the entire community had gathered around the barn. Apache families sat alongside settler families, the rigid separations of the past rendered meaningless by a year of shared labor, meals, celebrations, and hardships. Reverend Clark, who had undergone perhaps the most surprising transformation of all, stood to offer an opening prayer that honored both Christian teachings and Apache spiritual beliefs, theological integration that would have been unimaginable before the flood. Lieutenant Cooper, resplendent in his dress uniform, rose. "Next, 1 year ago," he began, "I came to this valley with orders to enforce separation between people who I believed could never coexist peacefully." He paused, surveying the gathered faces. "I have never been so grateful to be proven wrong." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Cooper unfolded an official document. "By order of the territorial governor, with approval from the Department of War and Indian Affairs, the settlement of Harmony Creek is hereby granted permanent status as an integrated community with special dispensation for cooperative residents." His voice strengthened with evident satisfaction. "Furthermore, the successful model established here is to be studied for possible implementation in other regions where conflicts have persisted." Cheers erupted from the assembled crowd. Margaret felt Náshdí's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with her own in a gesture that mirrored their lives' separate traditions woven together to create something stronger than either alone. As the celebration continued into evening, with music and dancing that blended cultural elements as naturally as their community had, Margaret and Náshdí slipped away briefly to the quiet corner of the barn where their story had begun. The carved beam above them, the first one where Náshdí had openly shared his protective symbols, remained exactly as it had been during those urgent days before the flood. "Did you know it would lead to this?" Margaret asked, gesturing toward the thriving celebration. "When you first came to my gate, could you have imagined what would grow from that moment?" Náshdí considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Dreams showed water would change valley," he finally replied, "but not how water would change hearts." He touched the carved spiral gently. "Some paths water makes, even spirits, cannot see clearly." From outside came the sound of children's laughter, Apache and settler children playing together in the twilight, their young minds unburdened by the prejudices of previous generations. The barn was just the beginning, Margaret realized. The flood washed away more than buildings and boundaries. "Yes," Náshdí agreed, his eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. "Water destroys, but also brings new seeds. What grows after depends on what we choose to plant." Together, they rejoined the celebration, moving among their people, for they were now truly one people, forged in floodwaters and tempered by shared purpose. The barn that had started their journey stood as silent witness to what was possible, when ancient wisdom and new beginnings flowed together like converging streams, creating something more powerful than either could have been alone.